Hey guys, Veronica here. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about cover crops. Now this is going to be something that I will just go on and on about for as long as you know me, because as I get deeper into working with the field, I'm finding that there's a lot of benefits to cover cropping. And a lot of the questions I tend to get are things about how I fertilize my soil, or can I reuse my soil from this season for next season, or do I have to throw it away? So we're going to cover all of that today and hopefully leave you with a couple of things as far as action items that you can do for your own home garden. So a couple of notes that I have on cover cropping. The things that you need to think about are you growing a winter crop, or are you going to skip your winter cropping season and just wait until next spring to grow again? There's really no wrong answer there, and you can grow cover crops with your winter crops. I would just recommend getting your winter crop established first and then adding the cover crops below, and also going with ones that are going to stay a little bit shorter, like getting clovers and whatnot started versus, doing like massive stands of alfalfa or rye or wheat. But one of the things that I find that to be the most interesting when it comes to cover cropping is that there's a bunch of different applications as far as if you've dealt with certain pest or disease issues, if you're having certain soil issues. Cover crops can help you work through a lot of these problems without spending a ton of money on various chemical fertilizers or fungicides or pesticides or whatnot. So like, for example, mustard and other brassicas are a really great cover crop if you were dealing with root knot nematodes. They're going to help suppress that organism in the soil, so that if you've had issues like on tomatoes with root knot nematode, then potentially you can work with mustards and other brassicas. I know that people talk about marigolds and whatnot, but like, this is a good thing that you can put in your soil in the winter to help alleviate that issue. If you're having issues with nitrogen, again, like we've talked about before, working with legumes like the winter peas, there's also a handful of beans and lentils and all kinds of stuff that you can plant to help fix the nitrogen in your soil. And there's things like winter wheat and rye and other grasses and grains that you can plant to help build biomass, to help draw nutrients to that from the subsoil to a higher area to improve soil tilth. They're really magic, I think, and when you get a good combination of them working in tandem with each other, that's when you start really building soil with the soil you already have. So you don't have to throw away your used or spent soil from this season, and you don't have to go and fork in a bunch of compost or build a bunch of compost, although that is helpful. But planting cover crops, if you're going to rest your beds, even if you're not, or containers, is a really nice way to go about reconditioning your soil for the next season. So right here in this cup, I got a really big bag of cover crop seeds. The other day I ordered some, and so it's a mix of like, I want to say there's close to 24 different crops in here, and they're not all winter appropriate, but part of my method to my madness with this was that I wanted to see what would grow, and adding a few extras to the blend didn't cost me really anything more. So I just decided, I was like, well, if I lose those seeds, I lose those seeds, but let's see if I can't plant late enough to have the winter stuff come up before we get a really cold frost, and then maybe the spring stuff will hang out in the soil until it's time for it to sprout in the spring. I don't know if that's actually going to work, but Texas weather is all over the place, so it kind of made sense to me to get a really high diversity of seeds and then see what works, and then go from there and order what works the following season with maybe a little bit less diversity or different diversity. So we'll see how this works out. There's certain ones in here that will grow up to frost, and then the tops will die off, and then in spring they'll continue growing again. All of the grasses and grains were going to give me great biomass and mulch on top of the soil, which is something that we need anyway, but it's also going to give me roots in the soil, which is something that we wouldn't get from putting either bark mulch or straw on top of the soil. And then there are certain ones too, like the clovers and mustards and whatnot, that again will grow, and then some of them will even keep growing here, I think, through the winter, because we don't get heavy, really heavy cold like hard freezes or we don't get snow. So it's nice to have something in your soil at all times. And so if you're not growing a crop, this is the way to do it, because otherwise you're going to be looking at, I mean, even if you're in containers or raised beds, you're looking at some amount of runoff. You're looking at, losing some of that topsoil that you probably spent a lot of time or money or both getting there in the first place. So let's mitigate that issue. Now I have 2 pots in front of me because this is part of the experiment that I'm going to run. I have a really cool tool I've been playing with called the microbiometer, and basically measuring the microbial biomass of my soil. Now this soil that's in these containers is from the compost pile, and it's basically a mix of some food scraps that have been buried in native soil that's mostly clay. I think there's maybe a little bit of ash in here too, which is kind of, hopefully doesn't skew the experiment too much because we already have kind of alkaline soil, but we'll see what happens. One of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to plant one and then leave the other one empty and cover them both with compost, just so that we have kind of a control and test. And then we're going to see and test in a couple of weeks what the microbial biomass is in both containers, to see how effective cover cropping is in feeding the microorganisms that live in your soil, while they're helping contribute to building more topsoil from all of this plant residue, both above and below the soil. So above and below the top of the soil. So yeah, it's going to be fun. One of the things that I like to do whenever I'm setting things up for cover crops, and the field's going to be a different story, but if I'm doing this in, say, a bed or a pot, and I wouldn't do pots smaller than these. If you have pots smaller than these are I'd say probably 2 or 3 gallons. But if you have ones that are smaller than that, you might want to get just a large container that has holes, or a spot somewhere in the corner of your yard where you can dump all of your containers and then grow on that, because it's just, I don't think that it's as effective in a smaller container. You really want it to be kind of a group mass sort of thing. But one of the things that I do that you can decide which way you want to go on this, is rather than pulling a plant, if the plant hasn't shown any signs of pathogens or disease or pests and it's been growing really well all year, one of the ththings I'll do rather than pulling it out and pulling the roots out is I'll actually cut it at the soil line. Now I'm going to do it with this guy because it's a example and it's not actually growing in this, but I like to leave the roots in place because that contributes to the soil structure. And especially as you start looking at larger volumes of soil, you really want to keep that structure in place as much as possible. And so, whether you're turning soil or whether you're, double digging it and pulling roots out, you're still kind of destroying the structure that has been built up there. And so I like to not mess with the structure as much as possible. So I'll just cut this guy out right at the soil line, and then the roots will decompose in place. Sometimes people don't really like working around all of these little stumps sticking out of the soil. And so the way to get around that is you take some compost and you're just going to cover everything, just enough so that you have a nice, flat, smoothish surface for all of your cover crop seeds to adhere to. And so I'll just get enough until I can't see that soil below it. And this was a compost blend that I had lying around. Hopefully it'll help give these cover crop seeds a little bit of a boost. And so then what I'll do is I'll just take these seeds and I'll just sprinkle some on top. I'm going to go kind of heavy on this just so we can get a really good reading because it's a small container. But it's a lot of grasses, grains, legumes, some mustards, and other brassicas. And I'm only going to do it in one so that we can test them side by side. That might be too heavy, but we're going to find out. There's a few things in here, like I said, that are summer. I've got some garbanzo beans, and there's some other sort of bean. The lentils, I think, will start or not start in the winter. We'll see. We'll see how those work out. But just playing with a mix and figuring out what works in Texas, because just because something says summer everywhere else doesn't mean that it necessarily won't grow here in the winter, depending on what our temperatures do. And so that's pretty much it. I'll tap those down. And then I'm going to put another layer of compost on top of those. Just a really light layer because there's lots of small seeds. And I don't want to keep them from growing. And then what'll happen from there is that I will take them over into the nursery, into the sunny part in the middle, and they'll just get put on the watering system from there. So they'll get water basically for the next couple of weeks, and you just want to water it like you'd water any other crop until it gets to a point where you're seeing enough growth and whatnot. And then from there you can cut it back and use it to mulch your container, or you can just let it grow and let it die off naturally in the winter. Again, I'm adding compost to this other one, to the control, just to keep them relatively similar, and then the only variance is that this one has seeds and this one does not. Hopefully nothing sprouts in this, but it's going to get watered as well, because microbes like water. So both will get water and both will get observation, and we'll test and see what the microbes are doing, and then probably grow something in them either this winter or next spring, just to compare, like, does it really make that big of a difference as far as having cover crops to condition that soil. Now, if you are working with soil that you bought in bags, or that you don't necessarily know the origin of, but it's really clean and screened and whatnot, it may not have the sort of microbial activity that you're looking for in order to associate with the crops that you're planting. And so one of the things that I might recommend doing there is to poke around like the corner of your yard, or maybe like the edge of a park or something, and find some leaf duff and just get a little scoop of that to add in, kind of mix into your soil a little. So yeah, you would be disturbing the soil then, but it's for the sake of getting microbes into that soil so that they can start working with everything else. But if you're in a raised bed, you more than likely have them kind of hanging out nearby and you just don't know it yet. Or maybe you do know it because you're already doing this. So that's basically pretty much everything that that this is about. I'm looking at my notes here to see if I'm missing anything. But yeah, I'm doing this not just because it's a good way to feed the crops that I want to grow next year and essentially feed the soil, and the soil is able to effectively feed the crops. But it also, a lot of these plants will attract pollinators, so when they flower in the spring, you're going to have a much earlier instance of both pollinators and beneficial insects. So when you get your crops in and the pests show up, your dream team will already be there working on them, which is always great. Also, I do this instead of looking to synthetics to feed my plants, because there's actually some research on nitrate buildup in the soil, and it turns out that potentially, or does, outcompete the natural sources of nitrates and like just nitrogen in general, and it makes it a lot harder for those sources to be accessible by plants. And so we're basically creating this sort of snowball effect that we're not going to be able to outrun at some point, never mind the amount that runs off into our groundwater that we collectively share. So we're going to try and avoid that by planting covers so that they help catch runoff, they help condition the soil, they help feed our ecosystem through our pollinators and everyone else. Trying to think if I missed anything else here, because there's just so much to cover when it comes to feeding the soil web with cover crops, and I could talk about it all day long. But if you're looking as a home gardener, so this was important. If you're looking for things for you to plant as a home gardener and you don't know where to start, there's a couple of options as far as winter, what I'd recommend. Any annual ryegrasses or winter rye, but again, those may behave in an allelopathic way towards some brassicas. So if your next crop is like broccoli or kale or mustard or anything in those families, then you might want to avoid doing rye and do like winter wheat instead. Hairy vetch and red clover are really great additions in this sort of space. I would recommend, if you don't want to buy, there's a lot of places online where you can buy a winter mix and like plug in what you want. But you can also, one of the things that I found out recently, and I say recently, but it was a few months ago, is that you can go to your local feed store, and a lot of them will have deer plot seeds for deer plot food on the shelf there somewhere. And so ask them where the deer plot seeds are. A lot of those are like really intense mixes of clover. Some of them will have alfalfa or canola And so just like look at the label and kind of decide what you want. But clover is never like a bad idea. Alfalfa is probably your best choice as far as nitrogen fixation and, you know, creating quick residue. But it does take a couple of years to really see a significant impact from alfalfa. But having some cover on the ground is better than none. And it was a couple pounds of clover seed for like less than $20 at, I think it was one of the feed stores. So check out like your local feed and supply store and see if they don't have something like that if you don't want to do mail order. But I do recommend doing mail order just because you can get a better diversity, usually for a little bit less money, often known to be organic, or figuring out, you know, what the source is. You don't want to put things that have been sprayed significantly as a cover in your soil, and that does happen. So you kind of poke around and do your research on that. I think that's pretty much everything on this. We discussed, nematodes. We discussed, so that's one other thing, and then we'll close this out, is that some people are like, well, I don't want to plant cover crops because I can't eat them. Well, that's not true. So with the winter peas last year, I found out that I really like the greens. Like, you're not going to get a snap pea or snow pea crop off of them to any significant extent. Like, they'll grow peas, but they're not super tasty. But the greens were great. And so I was eating pea shoots for months, you know, as they continue to grow, and just trimming them. And because you have a huge plot, you can continue to trim them, and they'll continue to bush out until they've run their course. It's the same with a lot of other things that I have in the seed mix. So there's things like mustard, I think it's like a kale or collard, somewhere in that space. There's turnips and radishes. And so there's a lot of things in cover crop mixes that you can actually do as sort of like a hands-off crop to feed your soil, but also to feed yourself. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. As always, if you like what you see, please hit that subscribe button and follow me on Instagram at FlavorKit for basically this sort of stuff. But it's going to be a lot of, you know, gardening and soil remediation here for the next few months, really. I mean, we might do a few winter things here and there, but I think most of the stuff is just going to be going on in the greenhouse, and then really working on the soil in the field. A little bit different technique on cover crops out there than in containers and raised beds, but I wanted to cover this first because I know that's what most of you guys are working with. So anyway, until next time, happy gardening.